Welcome, my friends, to Beyond Earth Stories. I'm truly grateful that you're here with me, and together, we're about to step into a journey unlike any other. On this channel, we go far beyond the surface of our daily lives. We wander into the forgotten corridors of time, we search for the hidden truths of our planet, and we listen closely to the whispers of Earth itself. Tonight, I invite you to settle in. Breathe slowly and allow your imagination to drift with me as we open the first pages of the greatest story ever told, the story of Earth. Have you ever paused to consider that our entire human existence, every empire that has risen and fallen, every word ever written, every dream ever dreamed, all of it is but a flicker in the immeasurable history of this planet Earth has been here for over 4.5 billion years. By comparison, humans, modern Homo sapiens, have walked this surface for less than 200,000. If we condense the history of Earth into a single year, our entire recorded civilization, from ancient Sumer to the digital world we live in now, would occupy no more than the final seconds before midnight on December 31st. It is humbling, almost dizzying to realize how small our story is in the grand scale of time. Yet, within that smallness lies something extraordinary. We are conscious. We ask questions. We look at the stars and wonder not only about where we come from, but about whether we were ever truly alone here. Could it be that Earth has carried other stories before us, other civilizations, other dreams now buried beneath time and stone? That possibility lingers like an echo in the silence of ancient mountains. But before we can explore those mysteries, we must begin at the beginning. To understand ourselves, we must first understand the world that bore us. So, let us step back far beyond the age of pyramids, beyond the time of the mammoths, beyond even the first creatures that dared to crawl from the sea. Let us return to the birth of Earth itself. Picture, if you will, a young sun burning hot in a chaotic cosmos. Around it, a swirling disk of dust and gas collapses under gravity, clumping together into bodies, both small and large. Collisions are violent, relentless. Worlds are born only to be shattered and born again. Among them is Earth, our home still molten, glowing like an ember in the darkness. The early Earth was not the gentle blue and green sphere we know today. It was fire. Oceans of magma rolled across its surface. Volcanoes erupted constantly, spewing gases that would one day form our atmosphere. Asteroids and comets bombarded the planet in endless fury, delivering both destruction and, paradoxically, the seeds of life. Many scientists believe that much of the water in our oceans arrived in this way, carried within icy comets that slammed into Earth billions of years ago. Each collision was catastrophic, yet each left behind something vital. Elements, minerals, and above all, water. Imagine standing on that young Earth if it were possible. The ground shakes endlessly. The sky is filled with ash and fire, and rivers of molten rock stretch as far as the eye can see. There is no breath to draw, no living thing to see. And yet in this hostile chaos, the conditions for life are being prepared. Over time, the planet cooled. The crust solidified. Rains fell for the first time, perhaps lasting for millions of years, filling the deep basins with water, creating oceans that would cradle the earliest life. Lightning cracked across the skies, striking pools of chemicals, sparking reactions that over countless cycles assembled the first fragile building blocks of biology. In those early waters, life stirred. At first, it was nothing more than simple molecules combining, breaking apart, and combining again. But eventually, something extraordinary happened: self-replication. Molecules that could copy themselves emerged, and with them, the first true spark of life. These were the ancestors of everything we know: tiny, invisible, fragile, yet astonishingly resilient. For nearly 3 billion years, life remained simple, microscopic, and patient. Entire eons passed, with nothing more complex than bacteria and algae drifting in the seas. To us, this may sound uneventful, even boring, but in reality, it was one of the most crucial chapters of Earth's history. For within those tiny cells, evolution was experimenting, learning, and preparing for the leaps that would follow. And here is where imagination meets science. We can measure fossils, analyze isotopes, and simulate ancient climates, but we cannot yet fully grasp the mysteries of how life took hold. Was it a miracle unique to Earth, or does it happen wherever conditions are right? Were we the inevitable outcome of chemistry, or a rare accident in the vast silence of the cosmos? As I reflect on these questions, I find myself humbled. If life is common, then the universe may be filled with beings asking the same questions we ask. But if life is rare, if Earth alone carries it, then we are living on the most precious oasis in all of existence. Either way, the story of Earth's beginnings is not just about rocks and water, it is about possibility. But let us not forget, Earth itself was not a passive stage. It was and still is an active, restless, living planet. Volcanoes reshaped continents. The moon formed after a colossal collision with a Mars-sized body tugged at our oceans, creating tides that influenced early life. The shifting of tectonic plates raised mountains and split oceans. The planet was sculpting itself constantly, as if preparing a home for what was to come. Sometimes when I stand by the sea and watch the waves crash against the shore, I imagine those first tides billions of years ago. They would have looked the same, and yet everything was different. No birds, no fish, no plants, just water, wind and rock. And yet, hidden in those waters were the seeds of everything to come. It amazes me to think that within those primordial oceans, every story was already waiting. The forests of the Carboniferous, the reign of the dinosaurs, the rise of humanity, all of it slept in the DNA of those first microbes. The earth was whispering a promise even then that life once begun would not easily be extinguished. And so we begin our journey here at the dawn of Earth. From fire and stone, from chaos and collision, from the endless patience of molecules in water, life was born. This is where our story begins, not with us, not even with animals or plants, but with a spark of persistence in a hostile world. As we move forward, we will see how this spark grew into vast oceans of diversity, how it endured extinctions and cataclysms, how it reached for the stars within cave walls and human dreams. But for now, let us pause and reflect on the enormity of what it means that everything we are, everything we know, rests on the fragile thread that began in those first silent waters. This, my friends, is the opening of Earth's secret history, and we are only just turning the first page. The rains did not arrive all at once, but when they came with a force that must have seemed endless. The steam that had risen from Earth's cracked crust, released by countless eruptions, condensed into clouds so thick they turned the skies into a ceiling of gray. For millions of years, the cycle continued, evaporation and condensation, storm after storm, until the first true seas were born. Those seas shimmered under a pale young sun, their waves restless and untamed, stretching wider with every century. I can almost hear it, the hiss of water striking hot stone, the roar of rivers cutting channels through jagged lava, the first ocean tides pulled by a moon still closer to Earth than it is today. The surface of the planet, once red and blistered, began to turn blue. What had been fire became water, and with that transformation, Earth took its first step toward becoming the world we know. Yet the oceans were not serene. They were cauldrons of chemistry filled with minerals washed from volcanic rock, stirred by currents charged by lightning that split the skies. Energy coursed through them in waves, breaking and reforming molecules, creating new combinations with every strike. Within these restless waters, chance became creativity. Out of raw elements, patterns began to emerge, molecules that clung together, that folded and spiraled, that resisted being broken apart. There must have been countless failures, combinations that formed for a heartbeat and dissolved again, fragile shapes lost to the depths. But nature is patient in a way we can hardly imagine. What failed a billion times might succeed once, and once was enough. Somewhere in those ancient seas, something extraordinary occurred, molecules that could copy themselves, holding within their fragile strands the potential of life itself. They were not alive in any sense we would recognize, no beating hearts, no thoughts, no purpose. Yet they carried the essence of what life would become, the ability to persist, to adapt, to change. These first replicators were like whispers in the silence of deep time, tiny signals that said, "Here in this water, something new has begun." As they multiplied, they changed their surroundings. Some absorbed energy from chemical reactions near volcanic vents. Others captured the faint warmth of sunlight filtering into shallow pools. Over generations measured not in years, but in millions of years, these molecules grew into cells protected by delicate membranes, floating like invisible seeds in the endless ocean. The Earth had shifted again. It was no longer merely a world of stone and water. It was a world that carried life. I often think about those first cells drifting unseen in seas, untouched by fish plants or any creature with eyes. Entire continents rose and fell. Entire mountain ranges eroded to dust while they simply divided, adapted, and endured. For nearly 3 billion years, the oceans belonged to them alone. They were the rulers of Earth not by force, but by resilience. And in their slow, steady persistence, they laid the foundation for everything that would come. The presence of water made their survival possible. It shielded them from the sun's harsh radiation, cooled the heat of the crust, and provided the medium through which nutrients and energy could flow. Without the oceans, life would never have taken root. Every breath we draw today, every heartbeat, is a quiet echo of that first covenant between earth and water. But water shaped more than survival. It sculpted the very face of the planet. Rain carved valleys, rivers braided across plains, waves ground stone into sand that drifted with the tides. The seas deepened and widened, reflecting the skies, catching the colors of dawn and dusk. They were not yet inhabited by creatures, but already they were alive with movement and transformation. There is something humbling in realizing that long before forests and deserts, long before mountains carried snow on their peaks, the oceans were Earth's first landscapes. To gaze at them now is to see not only beauty, but memory, the same waters, though recycled endlessly, that once cradled the first stirrings of life. Even as life remained simple, the oceans were preparing for greater things. Currents carried nutrients across vast distances, mixing chemicals that gave rise to diversity. Hydrothermal vents created pockets of heat in the cold abyss where reactions thrived in sheltered niches. Shallow tidal pools, warmed by the sun and enriched by minerals, provided another stage for experimentation. Everywhere, water flowed, possibility followed. And though we may never know exactly where it happened, whether in the darkness of deep-sea vents or the shallows of coastal pools, the emergence of self-sustaining, self-replicating life was the turning point that set Earth apart from countless barren worlds. The silence of rock had given way to the whisper of biology. I imagine what it must have been like, though. No eye was there to see it, a microscopic bubble of life suspended in the sea, dividing into two, then four, then eight. Nothing noticed, nothing celebrated yet. From that quiet act of replication stretched the unbroken thread that would lead billions of years later to every creature, every tree, every human being who has ever lived. The oceans were more than wombs. They were mirrors. They reflected the skies, yes, but they also reflected the restless energy of the planet itself. The tides pulled by the moon created rhythms that would one day shape the cycles of all living things. The storms churned their surfaces, stirring nutrients that would feed future generations of organisms. Water was not passive. It was dynamic, creative, and relentless. Even now, when I stand at the shore and listen to the waves, I hear echoes of those first restless seas. Their rhythm is ancient, older than mountains, older than life itself. Every tide carries the memory of beginnings. It is striking to me that in nearly every human story, across every culture, water holds sacred meaning. Myths speak of creation, from the sea of floods and rebirth of rivers that mark the boundary between life and death. Perhaps these stories persist because deep within us lies the memory of our origin. We are creatures of water. Our blood carries the same salts as the ancient seas. Our bodies are mostly water shaped by its cycles dependent on its flow. To honor water is in a sense to honor our own beginnings. But the oceans were not unchanging. They rose and fell with shifting continents, deepened as tectonic plates pulled apart, closed as they collided. Over billions of years, supercontinents formed and broke, always surrounded by water. Each shift created new coastlines, new currents, new environments where life could adapt in novel ways. The restlessness of Earth and the persistence of water worked together, shaping both land and life. Even then, extinctions occurred on small scales. Entire lineages of microbes must have risen and fallen, or to changes in chemistry or temperature. Yet the oceans endured, and with them, life endured. It is a reminder that survival is never guaranteed, but as long as water flows, possibility remains. And possibility was enough. In the vast silence of early Earth, something irreversible had begun. From oceans born of storm and fire, life emerged, fragile but determined. That life would transform the atmosphere, reshape the planet, and eventually climb from the seas, to walk on land, to look at the stars, to ask questions about its own origin. All of that lay in the future, but the foundation had been set. As I think of it, I realize that water is not only Earth's first gift, but its most enduring one. It connects us across time to the very beginning. Every drop of rain, every river, every wave carries within it the story of creation. And to listen to that story is to remember that we are part of something vast, ancient, and unbroken. In the quiet depths of those early oceans, time stretched beyond measure. The molecules that had once been nothing more than drifting patterns of chemistry began to arrange themselves with greater complexity. They folded into shapes that resisted breaking apart, protected by fragile membranes that kept them safe from the chaos outside. With each division, with each replication, they became less fragile, less fleeting. And in this gradual transformation, the first true cells emerged. They were small, beyond imagination, invisible even to the sharpest eyes we could dream of. Yet within their tiny boundaries, something profound had awakened persistence. These cells were no longer mere chemistry, they carried the spark of continuity. One moment flowed into another, not as chance, but as lineage. For the first time, Earth held not just reactions, but ancestors. The oceans became crowded with these invisible pioneers. They drifted in currents, settled in sediments, clung to rocks along hydrothermal vents. Each cell carried its own small experiment in survival, adjusting to changes in heat, acidity, and pressure. Those that endured passed on their traits. Those that failed were forgotten, their molecules broken down and recycled by the sea. This was evolution in its most primal form, slow, blind, but unrelenting. I imagine those early seas as vast realms of silence, yet bursting with unseen activity. No fish leapt from the waves, no coral brightened the shallows, but beneath the surface, a war of molecules raged. Some cells found ways to harvest energy from chemical reactions breaking down minerals in the water. Others experimented with sunlight, capturing photons and turning them into fuel. Each innovation was like a tiny spark, and together over millions of years, these sparks lit the way toward greater complexity. Among the most transformative of these innovations was photosynthesis. Some ancient microbes discovered how to use sunlight to split water, releasing oxygen as waste. At first, that oxygen was poison to many forms of life. It rusted. The iron dissolved in the seas, turning oceans a reddish hue. Entire lineages perished. But oxygen also offered a new kind of energy, powerful and efficient. Slowly, the atmosphere began to change. What had once been a choking mixture of volcanic gases grew richer in oxygen, paving the way for the evolution of more complex organisms. It is strange to think that the air we breathe today, the invisible substance that sustains us with every inhale, was once nothing more than waste from ancient microbes. Yet that is the way of life. What one creature discards becomes the foundation for another. For billions of years, Earth belonged to microbes alone. They formed vast colonies called stromatolites, layered mounds that grew in shallow seas. Even today, you can find their descendants in places like Shark Bay in Australia, living fossils monuments to the earliest architects of life. When I see them, I feel as though I'm gazing back through deep time, watching the first steps of a journey that would one day lead to us. But those microbes were not static. They exchanged genes, adapted to new niches, spread into every environment water touched. Some thrived in the boiling heat of vents, others in the icy edges of glaciers. They colonized every corner of the planet long before animals or plants ever existed. Life was no longer an experiment. It was a force reshaping the planet itself. And yet, despite their success, these early forms remained invisible to the naked eye. For over 3 billion years, there was nothing larger than a cell. Entire epochs passed in microscopic silence. Continents drifted, mountains rose and fell, oceans deepened and vanished, and through it all, microbes endured. It is difficult to comprehend such patience, such slowness. Our own lives, fleeting and fragile, unfold in decades. But life's story in these early ages measured progress in billions of years. Sometimes I wonder what it means, this vast expanse of microbial time. Was it simply waiting, preparing for the right moment to leap into complexity? Or was it the destination itself, a world complete in its own way, needing nothing more? Perhaps intelligence, consciousness, and civilization are not inevitable. Perhaps Earth might have remained a microbial planet forever if not for chance catastrophe and the restless creativity of evolution. But chance did intervene. Oxygen, once scarce, grew more abundant. With it came the possibility of larger, more complex cells. Some microbes merged with others, forming symbiotic partnerships that became permanent. Within their shared walls, new abilities emerged: mitochondria to harness energy, chloroplasts to capture sunlight. These partnerships were not accidents that faded, they were revolutions that endured. From them came the eukaryotic cells, the ancestors of every plant, animal, and human alive today. In those moments, invisible though they were, the blueprint of complexity unfolded. The thread that began in simple molecules now wove itself into stronger strands. Division gave way to cooperation, individuality to community. Cells joined into colonies, colonies into tissues, tissues into organisms. What began as chemistry was becoming biology in its fullest sense. When I think about it, I feel awe at the humility of beginnings. From the smallest, most fragile units, life built everything. There were no shortcuts, no leaps beyond the laws of nature. Just persistence, patience, and the endless experimentation of time. That is perhaps life's greatest lesson, that greatness begins in smallness and endurance is the root of creation. Even as complexity rose, microbes remained. They never vanished, never ceded their place. To this day, they are everywhere inside us, around us, beneath us. They are the invisible majority, the true rulers of Earth. Civilization may belong to humans, but life itself still belongs to the microbes. We are latecomers, guests in their ancient dominion. The dawn of life then was not a sudden sunrise, but a slow and patient unfolding stretching across billions of years. From molecules drifting in restless seas, to cells dividing in silence, to microbes reshaping the planet. Every step was both fragile and monumental. Without them, there would be no oxygen to breathe, no complex cells, no plants, no animals, no us. And so, as I close this part of the story, I find myself humbled once again. The oceans cradled life, not just as water, but as memory, as continuity. They carried the whispers of molecules, the resilience of microbes, the first breath of oxygen. In their depths, The future of Earth was written not in stone, but in cells small and persistent, waiting for their time to shape the world. The presence of oxygen was at first no blessing. To the fragile cells that had thrived for billions of years in its absence, oxygen was a poison. It corroded it, burned it, destabilized delicate chemical bonds. Entire lineages of microbes comfortable in the low oxygen seas were driven to extinction as the gas crept higher in concentration. The oceans themselves turned strange, filled with iron that rusted into layers of red, staining the seabeds with bands of iron-rich rock we still find today. Yet where oxygen destroyed, it also created. Some cells discovered how to survive it, even how to use it. What had once been a toxic threat became a source of energy far greater than any that had come before. Oxygen allowed cells to burn fuel more efficiently, to grow larger, to form more complex structures. It was both a trial and an opportunity, a transformation so vast that it reshaped not only life, but the entire planet. The air itself changed. From a suffocating mixture of methane and carbon dioxide, the atmosphere grew rich in oxygen, thin but vital. For the first time, the sky turned a deeper shade of blue. The ozone layer formed, shielding the surface from lethal ultraviolet rays. The seas, once dark with dissolved metals, cleared and sparkled. Earth was not the same world it had been. It was brighter, cleaner, more inviting. In this new world, life began to experiment with forms that had never existed before. Larger cells with nuclei and organelles appeared, carrying within them the potential for endless variety. These eukaryotes were the architects of complexity, and oxygen was their fuel. They built stronger membranes, more intricate internal systems, and most importantly, they learned to work together. Some joined into colonies, others into multicellular organisms. What had begun as scattered whispers in the water was gathering into a chorus. I imagine what it must have looked like, though no eyes were there to see it. Microscopic organisms drifting in currents, forming filaments, mats, and tiny clusters that hinted at shapes to come. Silent revolutions unfolding in every droplet as cells learned the language of cooperation. None of it visible to the surface world of waves and storms, yet all of it crucial to the unfolding of Earth's future. The oxygenation of the atmosphere was not a single moment, but a long, uneven rise. Sometimes it spiked, sometimes it stalled, sometimes it dropped back to near nothing. Each fluctuation tested life, wiping out some lineages, pushing others to adapt. It was a crucible of change, one that forged resilience into the very fabric of biology. By the time oxygen stabilized at higher levels, the planet was transformed, and so was its living inhabitants. With oxygen came not only survival, but possibility. Energy that once limited life to small, simple forms could now support size, movement, and complexity. The foundations for future ecosystems were being laid, though they remained invisible for now. For hundreds of millions of years, life remained mostly microscopic. But the groundwork had been prepared. When the moment of expansion came, it would be explosive. What strikes me most about this transformation is how it illustrates the paradox of progress. What begins as catastrophe becomes opportunity. What seems like an end becomes a beginning. Oxygen nearly destroyed life, yet it became the very breath of every plant and animal that followed. It is a reminder that change, however violent, carries within it the seeds of creation. The great oxidation did more than alter biology. It altered geology, atmosphere, and climate. The iron formations buried in ancient rocks are its scars, the ozone layer, its shield, the blue skies, its signature. Every breath we take is a direct inheritance from that ancient revolution. And though it unfolded billions of years ago, we live within its legacy every moment. As I think about this, I realize how fragile our existence is. Had oxygen never risen, had photosynthetic microbes never captured light, the Earth might have remained a microbial world forever. No forests, no animals, no humans, only endless seas of single-celled organisms. The fact that we are here at all rests on the unlikely patient work of tiny creatures long forgotten. Sometimes, when I breathe deeply and feel the air fill my lungs, I wonder if those ancient microbes could ever have imagined what their waste product would become. Of course, they had no consciousness, no foresight. Yet their survival reshaped a planet. Without intent, without plan, they set the stage for intelligence, creativity, and civilization. The air itself is their monument. Life has always been shaped by what it cannot control: the tilt of the planet, the pull of the moon, the chemistry of the air. Oxygen was one of those uncontrollable forces. Yet, in adapting to it, life proved its greatest strength, the ability to transform challenge into opportunity. That ability, born in the silent depths of ancient seas, remains within us still. And so the story moved forward. From molecules to microbes, from poison to possibility, from a world without air to a world filled with it, Earth had taken another step. The seas that once shimmered with invisible cells now carried the breath of the future. And in that breath lay the promise of creatures, yet unimagined creatures, that would swim, crawl, walk, and eventually wonder about the story of their own beginnings. The seas had carried life quietly for billions of years. But when the time came, silence gave way to a bloom so sudden and so astonishing that it forever changed the rhythm of evolution. This was the Cambrian, an age when the oceans became crowded with forms of life no planet had ever seen before. What had once been invisible became visible, what had once been simple became elaborate, and what had once been passive began to move with intention. At first glance, the transformation might seem almost magical. For 3 billion years, Earth had been a microbial world, its oceans inhabited only by bacteria and single-celled eukaryotes. Then, within a span of perhaps 20 million years, a blink compared to the vast ages that had come before life, diversified into a dazzling variety of forms, creatures with eyes, with shells, with legs, with claws. It was as if the planet, after an eternity of preparation, had suddenly decided to paint in color rather than shades of gray. The seas swarmed with trilobites, armored beings crawling across the seafloor in countless shapes and sizes. Worms tunneled through sediments, leaving trails that told of movement, hunger, and exploration. Sponges built reefs that rose like underwater cities. Some creatures grew spines for defense, others developed jaws to bite. Eyes appeared, granting vision where before there had only been blind drifting. For the first time, predator and prey locked into an eternal dance, each shaping the other in an arms race that would never end. I imagine what it must have been like to stand at the shore of a Cambrian sea, though no human would exist for 500 million years. The water would have looked much the same as it does now. Waves curling and crashing under the sun, But beneath the surface was a world unrecognizable. Forests of sponges rose from the seafloor. Trilobites scuttled in herds, their shells glinting as they moved. Strange creatures with grasping limbs hovered in the water column, hunting with eyes that glowed in the filtered light. To dive into those waters would be to enter an alien realm, though one that was undeniably our own. The Cambrian bloom was not merely about numbers. It was about innovation. Evolution fueled by oxygen-rich seas and genetic experimentation unleashed an array of body plans that would echo through time. Almost every major group of animals alive today traces its ancestry back to this period. The blueprints for vertebrates, arthropods, mollusks, and countless others were written here in the shifting currents of Cambrian oceans. It fascinates me that so many possibilities appeared at once. Some body plans flourished and endured, while others vanished without descendants, leaving only fossils as whispers of what might have been. The Cambrian was both generous and ruthless, offering opportunity but demanding adaptability. To survive, creatures needed not only to exist, but to compete, to defend, to find new ways of feeding and moving. The pace of change accelerated, and with it, the diversity of life multiplied. Among the most remarkable fossils from this time are those of the Burgess Shale in Canada, where soft-bodied creatures were preserved in exquisite detail. There we find beings so strange they defy imagination. Hallucigenia with spines bristling along its back and legs that looked like waving tentacles. Opabinia with 5 eyes and a long flexible proboscis ending in a claw. Anomalocaris, a predator over 3 feet long, with grasping appendages and a mouth like a ring of plates. These were no gentle experiments. They were pioneers testing the limits of what life could be. When I look at images of these fossils, I feel as though I am peering into a dreamscape, a place where evolution let its imagination run free. And perhaps that is exactly what it was. A dream of possibilities, some realized, some abandoned, all shaping the course of life forever. But why did this explosion happen when it did? Scientists have debated this question for decades. Some point to the rise of oxygen, which provided the energy needed for larger and more complex bodies. Others suggest that the evolution of vision triggered an evolutionary arms race once creatures could see predators hunted more effectively and prey developed defenses, accelerating diversification. Still others argue that genetic innovations such as the development of Hox genes that control body structure opened doors that had never before existed. Perhaps it was all of these things together converging at the right moment to ignite the bloom. Whatever the cause, the result was clear. The world had changed forever. Life was no longer confined to the invisible. It had grown armor, eyes, mouths, and movement. It had become dramatic, dynamic, and visible on a scale never seen before. I often wonder how it must have felt had there been consciousness then to experience it, to live through the Cambrian seas. Perhaps it would have been terrifying, a world where danger lurked in every shadow, where predators roamed with unfamiliar shapes, where survival was constant struggle. Yet it would also have been wondrous, a realm bursting with novelty and beauty, where every corner revealed a form no eye had ever seen before. The Cambrian explosion reminds me that life is not always gradual. Sometimes it is sudden, unpredictable, overwhelming in its creativity. For billions of years, evolution had moved at a glacial pace, shaping microbes in silence. Then, as if impatient, it unleashed a flood of forms in a geological instant. The earth, once quiet, had learned to sing. Yet, even amid this bloom, extinction was constant. Most Cambrian creatures left no descendants, their lineages ending as abruptly as they began. But extinction is not failure. Each vanished form left behind lessons written in DNA experiments that guided the future. What survived carried the memory of those that did not, weaving their contributions into the great tapestry of life. And through it all, water remained the stage. The oceans carried this drama, nurtured it, and sustained it. Waves that once cradled silent molecules now supported bustling ecosystems. Currents that once stirred chemistry now carried predators and prey. The seas had become theaters of survival, and Earth itself had become a planet alive with drama. Sometimes I close my eyes and imagine drifting in those waters, weightless, watching trilobites crawl beneath me, while bizarre creatures with grasping limbs glide overhead. The sunlight filters down, catching on shells and spines, illuminating a world both alien and familiar. I remind myself that these are not fantasies. They are history written in stone, carved into the fossils that scientists uncover with careful hands. We are not separate from them. We are their descendants. The shapes they pioneered, the struggles they endured, the victories they won, they live on in us. The Cambrian bloom was the dawn of animal life, and with it, the dawn of complexity as we know it. From this foundation would rise forests, reefs, insects, dinosaurs, mammals, and finally humans. Every creature that has ever walked, flown, or swum carries within its body a blueprint drafted in those ancient seas. The symmetry of our limbs, the complexity of our organs, the very way our cells communicate, all of it traces back to the Cambrian. And so, standing here in the present, I cannot help but feel gratitude for that bloom. Without it, the world would still be microbial, silent, unseen. The oceans would still shimmer with life, but no eyes would ever see, no voices would ever speak, no minds would ever wonder. The Cambrian explosion gave us more than diversity. It gave us the possibility of wonder itself. As I let that thought settle, I realize how precious this story is. Life does not move in straight lines. It lingers, it leaps, it stalls, it surges. The Cambrian was one such surge, a moment when Earth's creativity overflowed and reshaped everything. To remember it is to remember that we are born of both patience and surprise, of slow persistence and sudden bloom. The seas of the Cambrian have long since vanished, their creatures buried in stone, their reefs ground to dust. But their legacy surrounds us still in the eyes that see, the bodies that move the endless dance of predator and prey. To live today is to carry the memory of that ancient bloom within our very cells. And so, as the story of Earth moves forward, I carry with me the image of those seas, not silent anymore, but alive with movement and color. They are a reminder that life once begun does not rest. It experiments, it expands, it dreams. And sometimes it blooms. In the wake of the Cambrian bloom, life did not slow. It pressed forward, testing boundaries, growing larger, more complex, more ambitious. The oceans that had once been home to invisible microbes and tiny armored trilobites began to swell with giant creatures that dwarfed anything that had come before, bodies stretching meters, then tens of meters in length. The seas were no longer a quiet stage of small experiments. They had become kingdoms ruled by giants. I think often about what it meant for life to take this step. To grow large is to declare intention to demand more energy, more structure, more presence. It is not simply a matter of scale, it is a matter of survival strategy. In the oceans of the Paleozoic and beyond, size became both weapon and shield. Some creatures stretched their bodies to intimidate predators, others to dominate prey, and still others to reach untapped realms of the sea. Growth was possibility, and possibility became reality. Among the earliest of these giants were anomalocaridids, descendants of Cambrian predators that pushed their size well beyond anything else in their ecosystems. With grasping limbs and a circular mouth lined with plates, they prowled the seas like monsters from dreams. But even they would be outpaced by what came after. As evolution marched into the Ordovician, Silurian, and Devonian periods, the oceans became home to an ever-expanding caste of leviathans, armored fish. The placoderms appeared, their bodies encased in plates of bone that glistened like natural armor. Some, like Dunkleosteus, grew to lengths of 30 feet, their jaws capable of crushing through bone and shell with terrifying force. I imagine the deep silence of the Devonian seas, suddenly broken by the rush of water, as such a predator lunged its massive body a shadow over the reefs, its jaws snapping down with power that even time could not erase. And yet, even in their dominance, placoderms were only one chapter. The rise of true sharks followed sleek hunters with cartilaginous skeletons that gave them speed and agility. Cladocelaces tethacanthus and their kin patrolled the seas, refining strategies of predation that continue in sharks today. With streamlined bodies and endless rows of teeth, they became symbols of efficiency honed by millions of years of practice. The reefs themselves, built by corals and sponges, grew into vast underwater metropolises supporting entire ecosystems of life. Cephalopods, ancestors of modern squids and octopuses, extended their reach, some growing shells that spiraled outward in elegant coils, others stretching into straight cones that could reach several meters long. These early cephalopods became the giants of their time, drifting and hunting with intelligence that foreshadowed the cunning of their descendants. But the age of sea giants was not only about predators. Filter-feeding creatures also began to expand in scale, taking advantage of the ocean's richness. Some trilobites grew massive, grazing across the seafloor in herds. Others developed spines and elaborate armor, a reminder that in a world of giants, defense was as necessary as offense. Every adaptation was a response to the growing complexity of the ecosystem, a chess game played out in flesh and bone. As I imagine those ancient seas, I feel their density, life packed into every layer, from the shallow reefs to the open waters, from the muddy floors to the drifting plankton above. Schools of armored fish gliding together like armored fleets, sharks weaving through them with predatory precision, cephalopods spiraling through the depths with shells that glowed faintly in the filtered sunlight. To swim in those waters would have been to feel the pulse of a planet fully alive, a rhythm of struggle and abundance, unlike anything that had come before. But with size came vulnerability too. Giants required energy, and energy required stability. When climates shifted, when seas receded or warmed, many of these leviathans struggled. Entire groups vanished, replaced by new lineages better suited to the changing world. The seas were never static. They were battlegrounds of adaptation, where even the greatest fell when conditions no longer favored them. I cannot help but think of the lesson in this. Power, size, and dominance are temporary. What endures is adaptability, resilience, the ability to shift when the world changes. The giants of the sea were magnificent, awe-inspiring, but many of them left no descendants. Their bones turned to fossils, their stories preserved in stone, but their lineages ended. It is the small, the flexible, the overlooked that often survive the longest. Still, their presence mattered. They shaped ecosystems, drove innovation, forced prey to evolve defenses, and predators to grow sharper. Without the giants, the story of life would have unfolded differently. They were both rulers and catalysts, sparking creativity in the dance of evolution. As time passed, the seas saw waves of new giants rise and fall. In the Devonian, armored fish ruled. In the Carboniferous, sharks diversified into bizarre and powerful forms, some with teeth like circular saw blades, others with fins shaped into peculiar ornaments. In the Mesozoic, reptiles invaded the seas, giving rise to ichthyosaurs, plesiosaurs, and mosasaurs, each pushing size to new extremes. And much later in the age we call the Cenozoic, mammals returned to the water, and whales became the greatest giants Earth has ever known. But even here in the early ages of sea giants, the stage was set. The oceans proved that life could grow, not just in complexity, but in scale. They became a proving ground where evolution tested the limits of size and strength, revealing both the potential and the peril of reaching for greatness. I sometimes wonder what it would feel like to drift in those seas as a witness, unseen and untouched. To Sardikai above a reef and watch Dunkleosteus glide below its jaws, snapping down on prey with a soundless impact. To follow the spirals of a giant cephalopod as it hunted in the shadows. To see a school of armored fish scatter as a shark sliced through them like a blade through silk. It would have been terrifying, yes, but also sublime, an encounter with the raw, unfiltered power of life. And yet, even as these giants rose, the future was already being written in smaller, quieter forms. Tiny organisms continued to thrive in plankton blooms, feeding the giants above them. Early plants were beginning to colonize land, setting the stage for forests that would reshape the atmosphere, and in time feed rivers of life back into the oceans. The giants may have ruled the seas, but they were not alone, and their fates were tied to the smallest of creatures. In this way, the age of giants in the sea was both a pinnacle and a bridge. A pinnacle of size and dominance, and a bridge toward the next chapters of Earth's story. Chapters where the balance between land and sea, between giant and small, between predator and prey, would shift again and again. And so the oceans carried their giants, vast bodies, moving through vast waters, a living testament to the power of evolution. They remind me that life, once it began, was never content to stay small. It reached for more, always more, more size, more strength, more possibility. And in that reaching, it created a world of wonders, a world we are still discovering in fossils, pulled from stone, in bones weathered by time, in whispers carried by the waves. For billions of years, the oceans had been cradle fortress and stage. Every act of life's unfolding story had played out beneath the waves, from the first molecules that clung together to the rise of trilobites and armored fish. But eventually the boundaries of the sea could no longer contain life's ambition. The land, vast and empty, beckoned. It was silent, barren, and hostile, yet it held promise. Sunlight, unfiltered air, unclaimed, and soils waiting to be shaped. And so began one of the most audacious chapters in Earth's history, when life left the sea and learned to live on land. At first, the land was alien. No forests softened its contours, no birds crossed its skies, no grass cushioned its soil. The continents were harsh landscapes of rock and dust, windswept and dry, interrupted only by rivers and tidal flats where the sea licked at the edges. To imagine that desolate world is to feel the enormity of what life accomplished. To cross from water to land was not a small step, but a revolution, one that required invention after invention, adaptation after adaptation, all against odds that must have seemed impossible. The first pioneers were not animals, but plants. They arrived as tiny green algae, their ancestors long accustomed to shallow water and intermittent exposure to air. Some clung to rocks at the water's edge, enduring splashes of waves and periods of dryness. Over millions of years, they hardened their cells against desiccation, developed waxy coatings to keep in moisture, and built structures that could draw water upward from the ground. From these humble beginnings, the first mosses and liverworts crept across damp soil. Tiny mats of green against the grey world. It is hard to overstate what their arrival meant. The bare rock of Earth's continents, lifeless for eons, now carried the first blush of color. Green spread slowly, patch by patch, softening the land, breaking down stone into soil, and releasing oxygen into the atmosphere. These plants were small, delicate, and bound to water, but they were the vanguard of something greater. They proved that land could be inhabited, that it could nurture life as the seas had. Following them came fungi weaving partnerships with plants, exchanging nutrients for energy in a quiet alliance that continues to this day. Together, they built the first terrestrial ecosystems, primitive though they were, laying foundations upon which forests would someday rise. In time, vascular plants appeared, their stems stiffened by lignin, able to grow taller and transport water through their tissues. From them came ferns and horsetails, stretching higher, casting shadows on the ground. Forests of club mosses and giant ferns grew, their trunks rising like pillars, their canopies shading swamps below. The land, once barren, had become alive, but plants were only the beginning. Soon, animals followed. The first were arthropods, creatures already armored and adaptable, having thrived in the seas for millions of years. Millipede-like forms crawled onto shore, their bodies segmented, their exoskeletons protecting them from drying out. Some grew massive in the oxygen-rich atmosphere, their bodies stretching longer than any insect alive today. Spiders and scorpions followed, creeping through the undergrowth of fern forests, claiming the land as hunters. And then came the most daring leap of all vertebrates. Fish had dominated the seas, but some began to explore shallow waters where fins could press against mud and air could be gulped from the surface. Over time, those fins strengthened joints, forming that allowed movement not just in water, but on land. Their lungs, once emergency reserves, grew more efficient. Their bodies adapted to resist gravity, their senses sharpened to detect sound and scent in the air. From these pioneers arose the first amphibians, clumsy but determined, pulling themselves onto shore with uncertain steps. I imagine those moments, an amphibian heaving itself from a tidal pool, its body slick and heavy, its breath ragged, its movements awkward but resolute. It blinks against the sun, senses alien dryness pressing at its skin, but still it moves forward. Behind it, the sea still waits, but before it stretches a new world. No predator stalks these lands, no competition bars its way. The future belongs to those who can endure. The conquest of land was not swift. For millions of years, amphibians clung close to water, their eggs vulnerable to drying, their skins needing moisture. Yet each generation carried life farther inland, each adaptation making the land less hostile. Reptiles emerged with eggs protected by hard shells, freed at last from the need to return to water. With them, life broke its last tether to the sea and claimed the continents in full. The world transformed. Swamps spread forests, thickened rivers, teemed with amphibians, and land crawled with insects of sizes we would find monstrous today. The air grew heavy with oxygen, feeding fires that could sweep through forests, yet also fueling creatures that grew to sizes unimaginable. Dragonflies with wingspans of 2 feet drifted through the humid air, their compound eyes scanning for prey. Millipedes longer than a man's arm coiled in the shadows. The land once barren had become a realm of giants. But it was more than size. It was presence. For the first time, life walked across stone, flew above rivers, and rooted itself in soil. Earth had gained a second stage, a second theater of existence. No longer was the drama confined to the sea, it now played out beneath forests, across plains, and in skies that rang with the buzzing of wings. When I picture this transformation, I feel its audacity. Life was never meant to stay in one place. It reached beyond its beginnings, pushing into environments that seemed impossible. Every challenge, dryness, gravity, exposure, was answered with invention. Leaves to catch sunlight, roots to draw water, shells to protect young lungs to breathe air. Each adaptation was a step forward, a declaration that no frontier was closed forever. And yet, even in this conquest, the seas remained essential. Rivers carried nutrients from forests back to the oceans. Rain drawn by plants into the atmosphere cycled endlessly. The land did not replace the sea. It expanded the canvas of life. Together, ocean and continent created a richer, more dynamic earth, one where ecosystems intertwined in ways that bound them inseparably. Sometimes I walk through forests today and try to see them as they must have looked then. The trees are different. The creatures new, but the essence remains, life pushing upward, outward, always striving. Every root in the soil, every leaf catching the light is a continuation of that first daring step onto land. We are surrounded by reminders of courage, written not in words, but in branches and wings, in scales and shells. The conquest of land was not inevitable, nor was it easy. It was a gamble, one that demanded change at every level of existence. But it succeeded, and because it did, the earth became what we know. Our world of forests, mountains, plains, and skies, alive with birds, all of it rests on the shoulders of those first plants, those first insects, those first amphibians who crawled out of the sea and refused to turn back. And so the land was no longer empty. It was alive, and life would never relinquish it. The continents had been claimed, and with them the story of Earth entered a new chapter, one where creatures would walk and run, where forests would rise and fall, and where the stage was set for still greater dramas yet to come. The forests had risen, the air had thickened with oxygen, and the land was no longer a barren expanse. But as life expanded across the continents, a new kind of creature emerged to take command: reptiles, with their eggs sealed against the dangers of dryness, their bodies built for independence, and their potential written in every scale. From these resilient pioneers, a lineage arose that would dominate Earth for nearly 200 million years. This was their world, the age of reptiles when dinosaurs ruled. The earliest reptiles were small, unassuming beings scurrying through the shadows of carboniferous forests. They were survivors, finding opportunities where amphibians faltered. Unlike amphibians tied to water by soft eggs, and vulnerable skin reptiles carried their young in shells hard enough to withstand dryness, strong enough to resist damage. This simple adaptation was revolutionary. It freed them from rivers and swamps, gave them access to arid plains and uplands, and allowed them to march where amphibians could not. With that one innovation, reptiles unlocked the continents, and from that foundation they grew. By the time the Permian period dawned, reptiles had diversified into strange and powerful forms. Sail-backed Admeter, Dimetrodon prowled riverbanks, its spine rising like a great fin above its body. Massive parasaurs lumbered across floodplains, their hides studded with bony knobs. The Earth was a stage of experimentation, with reptiles taking shapes that seemed bizarre. Yet each was a test of survival in shifting climates. But the age of reptiles would not truly begin until after catastrophe. At the end of the Permian, the greatest mass extinction in Earth's history struck. Volcanic eruptions unleashed floods of lava, poisoning the air with carbon dioxide and methane, heating the planet, acidifying the seas. Over 90% of life vanished. Forests fell silent. Oceans emptied, and once crowded plains became graveyards. In the wake of such devastation, the world was empty, scarred and waiting for something new to rise. That something was the dinosaurs. From small, lightly built ancestors, they emerged in the Triassic period, quick and agile. Their bodies adapted for running their lungs, efficient for drawing oxygen in a warming world. At first, they were only one among many reptile groups, overshadowed by crocodile-like archosaurs and armored herbivores. But as extinctions trimmed their rivals, dinosaurs seized the open niches. They grew larger, more varied, more ambitious, until by the Jurassic they towered over the land. To walk among them would have been to feel small, insignificant, and awestruck. Sauropods rose like living mountains, their necks sweeping through the treetops, their legs as thick as tree trunks, their bodies stretching over 100 feet. Herds of them moved across floodplains like migrating forests, each step a tremor in the ground. Predators stalked them, massive theropods with teeth long as knives, jaws built for crushing, and eyes sharp with hunger. The Earth was no longer the world of amphibians or early reptiles. It was a realm of giants, of thunderous footsteps and roars that echoed across valleys. And yet, not all dinosaurs were giants. Some were small and swift, darting between ferns, hunting insects and scavenging scraps. Others took to the skies, evolving feathers that shimmered in sunlight, transforming scales into plumes, wings into instruments of flight. The first true birds rose from among them, their cries breaking the silence of dawns that no mammal had yet claimed. Dinosaurs filled every niche: grazers, hunters, swimmers, flyers. They were the architects of ecosystems so rich they reshaped entire continents. When I think of the age of reptiles, I see a world alive with color and sound, not the drab gray landscapes of old imagination. Feathers glowed with iridescence, scales shimmered in shades of green and gold, forests thrived with ferns, cycads, and towering conifers. Insects buzzed in clouds, rivers teemed with crocodiles, and skies darkened with flocks of pterosaurs. It was not a primitive world, but a vibrant living masterpiece. For millions upon millions of years, dinosaurs reigned. They adapted through droughts and floods, through shifting continents and changing climates. They survived volcanic outbursts, asteroid impacts smaller than the one to come, and the slow grinding of time. Their story was not one of fragility, but of persistence, of mastery. Humanity measures time in centuries, civilizations in millennia. Dinosaurs ruled for more than 150 million years, longer than our entire species has yet existed. And in their reign, they did more than survive. They flourished. Sauropods pushed the limits of size, evolving complex systems of air sacs that kept their massive bodies alive. Predators like Allosaurus and later Tyrannosaurus honed hunting to an art, their senses keen, their muscles powerful. Small feathered dinosaurs refined flight, creating blueprints for birds that would outlive them. They were not creatures frozen in time, but innovators, always adapting, always pushing boundaries. Yet even in their glory, shadows gathered. The earth has always been a place of cycles of rise and fall, and no dominion is eternal. When the Cretaceous period dawned, flowering plants spread across the land, transforming ecosystems, changing diets, reshaping landscapes. Dinosaurs adapted, some growing specialized jaws, others shrinking into forms more efficient. But evolution's clock was ticking toward catastrophe, a catastrophe that no innovation could prevent. I often wonder what it would feel like to stand in a Cretaceous meadow, flowers bright under the sun, herds of hadrosaurs grazing pterosaurs, wheeling overhead, a tyrannosaurus stalking in the distance. The air would smell of resin and fern. The ground tremble under footsteps heavier than any machine we've built. It would be alien, yes, but also familiar for the forests, the rivers, the skies. These are still our Earth. The dinosaurs were not foreign invaders, but children of the same planet that bore us. Their reign, for all its majesty, ended in fire. A rock 6 miles wide struck the Yucatan, unleashing energy greater than all the weapons humans have ever created. The sky burned forests, ignited oceans boiled, and within days the age of reptiles was broken. Darkness fell for months, perhaps years, choking plants, silencing ecosystems. Dinosaurs that had ruled for millions of years perished in a geological instant. But not all. Some small feathered dinosaurs survived, huddled in shadows, feeding on seeds and insects, carrying with them the spark of a lineage that would rise again. From them came birds, the last living dinosaurs, soaring today above our cities and forests, reminders that their reign is not truly gone. When I think of their story, I feel both awe and humility. Dinosaurs were not failures, they were success. Incarnate their time so vast it dwarfs our own. Their extinction was not weakness, but the randomness of chance, the cruelty of catastrophe. And yet, even in their fall, they gave way to something new. Their absence opened space for mammals, for primates, for us. We walk in their shadow, live in their legacy, breathe in a world they helped shape. The age of reptiles was a testament to life's ambition, to its willingness to reach for size, strength, and beauty. It was also a reminder of fragility, of the impermanence of dominance. The thunder of their footsteps may be gone, but its echo lingers in the rocks that hold their bones, in the birds that fill our skies, in the very imagination of humankind. To tell their story is to tell our own, for without them we would not be here. When the firestorm faded, when the dust slowly settled, when the silence after catastrophe grew thick and heavy, Earth was no longer the same. The dinosaurs, once masters of land, sea, and sky, were gone. The age of reptiles had ended in a sudden shudder, and into that vast emptiness stepped creatures that had long lived in the shadows, the mammals. They had been there all along. For over 150 million years, mammals crept through undergrowth, burrowed in soil, climbed in branches. At night, feeding on insects, hiding from the thunderous steps of dinosaurs. They were small, fragile, and mostly overlooked, their bodies no larger than rats or opossums, their lives dictated by the need to remain unseen. They were survivors, their strategies built not on dominance, but on endurance. And when the asteroid struck, when fire and famine consumed the giants, it was the small, the overlooked, the adaptable that endured. What fascinates me is how unremarkable they seemed at first glance. Tiny, shrew-like beings with fur and warm blood, their hearts racing, their metabolisms burning fast. But beneath that modest exterior lay a revolution. Unlike reptiles, mammals carried their young within their bodies, nourishing them with a placenta, protecting them until they could survive the outside world. After birth, they fed them with milk, ensuring survival even in harsh times. Their fur insulated them. Their warm blood allowed them to remain active in cold or dark. They were built not for grandeur, but for resilience. And resilience was exactly what the post-catastrophe world demanded. In the first years after the extinction, the Earth was scarred. Forests had burned, oceans had acidified, skies had been choked with dust. But as the sun returned and plants began to sprout again, ecosystems struggled back to life. And in this fragile recovery, mammals seized their chance. With the dinosaurs gone, niches that had been closed for millions of years stood open. The world was vast, empty, and waiting. They began small as always. Rodent-like forms scurried across the forest floor, feeding on seeds, roots, and insects. Some grew larger, adapting to graze on new vegetation. Others sharpened their teeth for meat, filling the predator roles once ruled by raptors and small theropods. Each generation reached further tested new ways of living. And slowly, size began to increase. Creatures that once fit in the palm of a hand grew into wolves, bears, horses, elephants. The mammals had risen, not in an explosion like the Cambrian bloom, but in a steady, relentless expansion. I imagine the Paleocene world just after the fall of the dinosaurs. Forests regrowing in patches, the air humid with renewal rivers, carrying life back into landscapes stripped bare. In these young ecosystems, mammals crept forward cautiously, still small, still vulnerable but braver now. With no tyrannosaurs stalking, no giant sauropods grazing, the land felt strangely open. It must have been quiet in those early days, the absence of dinosaur roars echoing louder than their presence ever did. Into that silence came the rustle of mammals, soft at first, then louder, multiplying with each season. By the Eocene, 10 million years later, the Earth looked utterly different. Mammals had diversified into a bewildering variety of forms. Some returned to the seas, becoming ancestors of whales, their legs transforming into fins, their nostrils sliding up their skulls to become blowholes. Others climbed trees, their hands grasping branches, their eyes adjusting to depth and distance. Early primates, cousins of our own story. Hoofed animals grazed across plains, their teeth evolving for grasses, their bodies for speed. Predators followed cats with saber-like teeth, dogs with jaws built for pursuit. The world was filling again, this time under mammalian dominion. What amazes me is how quickly they learned to innovate. Warm-blooded, they could thrive in environments too cold for reptiles. Social structures formed packs of hunters, herds of grazers, troops of primates. Their intelligence grew sharper, their problem-solving keener. Mammals did not simply fill the spaces left behind, they reshaped them. Forests echoed not with reptilian calls, but with the cries of monkeys, the howls of wolves, the trumpets of elephants. Yet their rise was not without struggle. Climate shifted repeatedly, testing their resilience. Ice ages gripped the planet, forcing migrations, extinctions, and adaptations. Continents drifted mountain ranges, rose oceans narrowed and widened. In each change, some mammals perished. Others thrived. It was not the strongest that endured, but the most adaptable, the ones willing to shift diets, habitats, behaviors. Evolution rewarded flexibility, just as it had from the very beginning. The story of mammals is not just one of biology, but of persistence. They remind me that survival is not always about being the biggest or the fiercest, but about being able to bend without breaking. A small rodent can outlast a giant if it can find food in the dark, if it can hide in burrows, if it can breed quickly enough to recover. This was the lesson written into mammals from the moment they lived in the shadows of dinosaurs. And it was the lesson that carried them into dominance. Among the mammals, one lineage began to stand apart. Primates, creatures with grasping hands, forward-facing eyes, and growing intelligence ventured into trees, then onto plains, experimenting with cooperation, communication, and curiosity. From them eventually came humans. But in this moment of the story, humanity was still millions of years away. For now, the stage belonged to creatures whose diversity rivaled the dinosaurs themselves. When I walk through a modern forest, I see them everywhere, the descendants of those early mammals carrying ancient strategies in every movement. The squirrel leaping from branch to branch, the deer grazing in a clearing, the wolf padding silently through underbrush. All of them are echoes of a time when mammals first tested their strength. And above them, a bird takes flight, the last dinosaur watching over the rise of its replacements. The transition from shadows to survival was not sudden, but gradual, patient, relentless. Mammals did not conquer the earth with thunder, but with persistence. They endured when giants fell. They adapted when climates shifted. They seized chances when they came. And in their rise, they carried the seeds of intelligence, of emotion, of consciousness itself. This was the beginning of our story. Though we were not yet written into it, the mammals laid the groundwork. Social bonds, problem solving, adaptability that would one day blossom into the human journey. But even without us, their story is one of triumph, a reminder that life does not need grandeur to succeed. Sometimes all it needs is to survive long enough to see opportunity and to be ready when it comes. The story of mammals had unfolded for tens of millions of years, filling the earth with endless variety. Hooves thundered across plains, tusks tore through forests, claws raked across river banks, and songs echoed from the seas. But somewhere among these countless forms, one small branch of primates began to stir with possibilities no other creature had yet tested. They did not grow the sharpest claws, nor the longest fangs, nor the swiftest legs. Instead, they carried something invisible, fragile, and yet more powerful than any weapon: the seeds of thought. In the shaded canopies of Miocene forests, where vines draped heavy and leaves filtered sunlight into shifting patterns, our earliest ancestors moved carefully from branch to branch. Their hands curled around wood with precision, their eyes looked forward, judging distance, their bodies swayed with balance, learned through generations. These creatures, ape-like, curious, restless, were not yet human. But in their grasping fingers and widening vision, I see the outlines of who we would become. The forest was their cradle. It gave fruit to pluck, insects to eat, and cover from predators. Yet forests also demanded awareness. To leap from one branch to another required judgment, timing, and memory. To know which fruit ripened and which poisoned required learning, sometimes painfully earned. Intelligence was no luxury here. It was survival. And slowly that intelligence grew. But forests are never eternal. Climate shifted again, as it always has. Rain diminished, forests thinned, and grasslands stretched wider across continents. Where once there had been endless canopy, there were now open savannas, broken by scattered trees and tall grasses. For primates who had known safety in branches, the ground was dangerous, exposed, uncertain. Yet some of them climbed down, stepping cautiously onto the earth below, trading the vertical world for the horizontal. With that step, the human dawn began. I try to imagine that first descent, the moment when one of our ancestors' fur, still thick body, still shaped for climbing, placed its foot on grass and did not return immediately to the branches. The air must have felt different, the view broader, the dangers closer. But there was also opportunity, new foods on the ground, new paths to travel, new horizons. Perhaps at first it was only necessity that drove them down. But necessity has always been the mother of invention. Walking upright was not immediate. At first they moved awkwardly, still leaning on knuckles, still reliant on trees for safety. But over generations, spines straightened, pelvises shifted, legs lengthened. Bipedalism emerged, not as a sudden leap, but as a gradual adaptation, each step freeing hands to carry, to throw, to hold. The very balance of the body changed, and with it the possibilities of what those hands could do. With hands free, tools became extensions of flesh. At first, simple stones used to crack nuts or smash bones. Later, sharper flakes chipped from rock blades that could cut meat, scrape hides, carve wood. Fire came after first stolen from lightning strikes or volcanic bursts, then eventually coaxed into existence by sparks. To control fire was to change the rules entirely. Nights no longer belonged only to predators. Food could be cooked, made softer, safer, richer. Cold could be driven away. Stories could be told in flickering light. Fire turned the darkness into a circle of safety and possibility. Every tool, every flame, every new behavior pushed our ancestors further from the world of instinct into the world of invention. They were no longer just reacting to their environment, they were beginning to shape it. This, I believe, is the heart of the human dawn, not simply standing on two legs, not simply making tools, but realizing that the world could be altered by thought and effort. As they spread across savannas, early humans hunted in groups, shared food, raised children together. Language, though still primitive, began to form sounds linked to meanings, gestures, tied to intentions. The bond between individuals deepened, no longer just instinctual, but social cultural. For the first time, knowledge could be passed not only through genes, but through words, teaching imitation. Fire carried warmth, but language carried memory, and with it, the future. The earth must have looked different to those first humans. Where other animals saw only survival, they began to see patterns. The movement of herds, the change of seasons, the phases of the moon. They watched, they remembered, they connected cause and effect. In doing so, they became not just participants in nature, but observers of it. And with observation came imagination. I imagine a night on the African plains 2 million years ago. A small group huddled around a fire, flames, crackling sparks rising into a sky brilliant with stars. Children drowsy against their mothers, hunters gnawing at roasted meat, eyes flicking to the darkness where predators lurked but did not enter the circle of fire. Someone gestures to the sky, pointing at the constellations, telling a story, perhaps not yet in full language, but in sounds and motions that carried meaning. Around that fire, humanity was born. From those beginnings, the pace quickened. Stone tools became more refined, shaped with intention rather than accident. Spears allowed hunting from a distance. Skins were stitched into clothing. Shelters were built. Each innovation widened the circle of survival, each one carried knowledge further. And as brains grew larger, so too did the capacity for abstract thought, for memory, for planning. The dawn brightened. Yet it was not an easy dawn. Life was fragile, survival never certain. Droughts killed predators, stock disease spread. Entire groups vanished, leaving no trace but faint echoes in our DNA. But others endured, moving across landscapes, adapting to mountains, rivers, deserts. Some left Africa altogether, spreading into Asia, then Europe, then beyond. Each migration was a gamble, a step into the unknown, but also a declaration we are not bound. When I reflect on this moment of the story, I feel both awe and gratitude. Our ancestors were not the strongest, not the fastest, not the fiercest. They were vulnerable, dependent on cooperation, reliant on fragile tools and fragile fires. And yet they endured because they carried within them a spark, No catastrophe could extinguish the spark of imagination. That spark would in time shape everything. It would build civilizations, paint caves with symbols, carve monuments into stone, send ships across oceans and rockets into space. But in the human dawn, it was still fragile, still tender, still learning to burn steadily. Around fires in forests on plains, through migrations, it flickered and grew. The story of the human dawn is not only the story of survival, it is the story of awakening. Awakening to possibility, to creativity, to self-awareness. It is the moment when life, after billions of years of blind adaptation, opened its eyes and realized it could wonder. And so the earth turned, seasons shifted, and generations passed. Hands grew deft, minds grew sharp, voices grew clear. From shadows in forests to firelit circles on savannas, humanity emerged not as conquerors yet, but as dreamers, as learners, as the bearers of a fragile flame. That flame would carry us forward. But here in the dawn, it was enough to light the darkness, enough to bind a tribe together, enough to begin. When the dawn of humanity stretched into morning, the scattered tribes that once followed herds and gathered fruits began to linger longer by rivers to shape stones into more than weapons, to notice that seeds scattered one season could sprout into food the next. What had once been only survival began to grow into something more enduring. We were no longer only wanderers across savannas or hunters in forests. We were builders, settlers, dreamers of permanence. The rivers were our first teachers. Along the banks of the Nile, the Tigris and Euphrates, the Indus and the Yellow River people discovered that water gave not only drink, but life to soil. Floods left behind fertile earth, and with it the promise of grain that could feed more than a family, more than a band. With harvest came storage, with storage came surplus, and with surplus came the possibility of something new: civilization. I imagine the first villages rising on riverbanks, huts of mud and reeds, clustered together, smoke curling from fires, laughter of children running barefoot through dust. These were fragile beginnings, still at the mercy of drought and flood, still dependent on the whims of nature. But already something had shifted. People stayed in one place season after season. They tended crops, domesticated animals, shaped clay into vessels, carved symbols into stone. The tempo of life slowed, roots sank deeper, and in those roots culture began to grow. Stone was our companion, as vital as water. From stone we built walls to guard against floods, tools to shape wood blades, to harvest wheat. And eventually, stone became monument, testimony, memory. In Mesopotamia, ziggurats rose toward the sky, stair-stepped towers that proclaimed both human ambition and reverence for the divine. In Egypt, pyramids anchored desert horizons, colossal triangles that aligned with stars, tombs for kings, but also symbols of eternity. To stand before such stone was to feel the weight of time itself, the determination of a species no longer content with fire and caves. Civilizations of stone and river carried within them both wonder and contradiction. They birthed writing, so thoughts could outlive voices. They charted stars, so time could be measured. They crafted laws, so chaos could be tamed. But they also built armies, so land could be taken, and chains, so people could be bound. The same rivers that nourished fields became highways for conquest. The same stones that built temples also built prisons. Humanity had gained permanence, but permanence brought both greatness and burden. What amazes me most is how quickly it unfolded. From scattered tribes to city-states, from huts to temples, from oral tales to written scripts, it was a blink in geological time, but a revolution in human history. Clay tablets in Sumer recorded deaths and harvests. Hieroglyphs in Egypt told stories of gods and pharaohs. The wheel turned grain into flour pottery, into art wagons, into transport. Metal gleamed first copper, then bronze, then iron, each step sharpening our tools, our weapons, our ambitions. And always the rivers remained central. They fed fields but also demanded reverence. When rains failed or floods destroyed, civilizations trembled. People looked to the heavens for explanation, for patterns in stars, for signs in eclipses. Religion and astronomy grew together, both attempts to understand forces larger than ourselves. Temples rose not only as places of worship, but as observatories where priests watched skies, charted planets, and wove myths into meaning. I often wonder what it felt like to live then in those first great cities, to walk crowded streets where merchants shouted, donkeys brayed, and incense drifted from shrines, to hear the clang of metal workers shaping bronze, the scratch of a stylus on clay, the splash of oars on a river. Life must have felt both wondrous and overwhelming, so much newness, so much permanence, so much possibility. But permanence also meant vulnerability. Where once a small band could move, when drought struck, a city could not. Fields required irrigation walls, required defense temples, demanded upkeep. The very success of civilization made it fragile, dependent on balance between river and rain, between ruler and people, between ambition and humility. When balance broke, famine followed, or a revolt or collapse. History is littered with ruins of cities that once seemed eternal, but now lie buried in sand and silence. And yet, for all their fragility, those civilizations gave us foundations we still stand on. The first alphabets, the first laws, the first libraries. Mathematics that could measure land, calculate trade, and predict seasons. Medicine that tried to heal bodies, philosophy that tried to heal minds. They turned chaos into pattern wilderness, into order time, into history. Without them, we would not know ourselves. Stone and river taught us permanence, but also humility. They showed us that to build is to risk collapse, that to gather is to risk envy, that to dream is to risk failure. But they also showed us that to risk is to live, and to live is to create. Civilization was not inevitable. It was chosen, shaped, fought for, and often lost. And yet, it always rose again in new places, with new names, on new rivers, with new stones. Sometimes I picture myself standing at the edge of the Nile, thousands of years ago, watching the sun set behind pyramids, half-built cranes of wood creaking, workers chanting as stones slide into place. Or walking through Babylon, hearing the hum of markets, the rustle of reeds in irrigation canals, the murmur of scribes bent over tablets. In those moments, I feel the pulse of humanity stretching forward, the same pulse that beats in us now. Civilizations of stone and river were the first to declare that humanity was more than survival. They declared that we could leave marks that outlasted lifetimes, that we could shape landscapes to our will, that we could reach toward heavens not with hands, but with monuments. They were flawed, fragile, impermanent, but they were also magnificent. They remind me that we are a species of builders, not just of stone, but of meaning, memory, and vision. And so the rivers flowed, the stones stood, and humanity marched forward. The seeds planted along their banks grew not just into crops, but into cultures, languages, and legacies. From river valleys to mountain tops, from ziggurats to pyramids, from clay tablets to carved steles, the story of civilization had begun. And it would not stop here. It would rise, fall, and rise again, carrying us ever closer to the world we know and beyond. Empires began as whispers villages that grew into towns, towns that grew into cities, cities that demanded more land, more food, more labor. With growth came ambition, and with ambition came the idea that one people could rule over many, that borders could stretch far beyond rivers, that power could be consolidated into crowns, thrones, dynasties. Stone and river had given us permanence, but empires gave us scale. The earliest empires rose where rivers had already nurtured civilizations. Mesopotamia saw kings carve their authority across fertile plains, their armies marching beneath banners woven with symbols of gods. Egypt stretched its reach beyond pyramids, its pharaohs declaring themselves divine, their voices carried by the Nile's waters. In China, dynasties began to stitch vast territories together, uniting valleys, mountains, and coasts under a single name. Each empire was more than land. It was an idea that humanity could be ordered, managed, and ruled on a grand scale. Empires were built with both vision and violence. They demanded roads and walls, palaces and fortresses, taxes and tribute. They also demanded stories. Myths became the mortar that held empires together. In Rome, myths of Romulus and Remus tied the city's destiny to divine origins. In Egypt, pharaohs claimed descent from gods, their rule sanctified by heavens. In China, emperors held the mandate of heaven, their legitimacy tied not only to armies, but to cosmic balance. These myths were not lies. They were necessary truths, scaffolding for the immense structures of human ambition. And yet, for all their grandeur, empires were fragile. They rose on the backs of armies, but armies could falter. They thrived on harvests, but harvests could fail. They depended on unity, but unity frayed under the weight of diversity, rebellion, and ambition. Every empire carried within it the seeds of its own collapse. Rome's roads stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia, but corruption hollowed its center. The Mayan cities rose like jewels in jungles, but drought and conflict brought silence to their temples. The Mongols thundered across continents, but their empire fractured as quickly as it expanded. What strikes me most is not their fall, but what they left behind. Even ruins spoke of magnificence. Columns in Greece, arches in Rome, walls in China, temples in Angkor, each stone whispered not only of kings and generals, but of masons, farmers, scribes, and dreamers. Empires may have crumbled, but their myths endured, their innovations carried forward, their memory woven into the fabric of humanity. The age of empires was also the age of exploration in spirit, long before ships crossed oceans. Curiosity was empire's quieter twin. As borders widened, so did horizons. Caravans carried silk and spices across deserts. Philosophers debated under colonnades about atoms, justice, and the stars. Astronomers watched planets move across skies, mapping patterns that would guide sailors centuries later. Every empire was both a conqueror and a library, hoarding knowledge alongside wealth-preserving wisdom even as it spilled blood. But then, sails filled with wind, and the world grew wider still. The age of discovery was not simply the extension of empire. It was the rewriting of maps. The realization that Earth was round, finite, and connected. When Europeans set sail across oceans, they did not only seek spices or gold, they sought proof that the world could be bound together, that no horizon was final. I imagine standing on the deck of a caravel in the 15th century, the sea stretching endless, the stars guiding the fare of falling off the edge, lingering in the minds of sailors. To leave the sight of land was to gamble with existence itself. Yet those sailors pressed forward, drawn by promises of wealth, by orders of kings, by whispers of mythic lands. And when they reached new shores, the world changed. Discovery was never innocent. For every charted coastline, there was a people displaced. For every spice unloaded in European ports, there was a village burned. For every myth of El Dorado, there was exploitation. The age of discovery was as much about conquest as curiosity, its sails driven by greed, as much as wonder. But even so, it transformed humanity's understanding of itself. Oceans were no longer barriers, they were bridges. Continents no longer existed in isolation, they were threads in a single web. For the first time, Earth felt whole. Empires adapted to this new wholeness. Spain and Portugal carved the seas with fleets their crosses and cannons claiming lands far from their own. Britain and France followed, weaving colonies into vast networks of trade, their flags planted in soil across continents. The Ottoman Empire held crossroads of east and west, while China's fleets reached into the Indian Ocean. The age of land empires gave way to maritime empires powered by sails, gunpowder, and hunger for expansion. And always myths followed. Discovery was cloaked in the language of destiny, of manifest purpose, of divine will. Empires told themselves they brought civilization, enlightenment, order. But beneath those myths lay the harsher truth of power and exploitation. To discover was often to take, to claim, to erase. Still knowledge spread with ships. New crops crossed oceans, potatoes and corn from the Americas, rice and spices from Asia, coffee from Africa. Diseases too spread, devastating populations unprepared for foreign germs. It was a world suddenly entangled, for better and worse, its fates intertwined. From this entanglement came both tragedy and transformation, both oppression and possibility. When I think of the age of discovery, I do not see only ships on waves. I see minds expanding old maps, discarded new stars charted. I see Galileo raising his telescope, Newton writing his laws, explorers sketching coastlines never seen before by European eyes. I see the spark of modern science flickering to life, fueled by the same curiosity that had once driven us from forests to fire. And yet, I also see shadows. I see chains on ships carrying human cargo across the Atlantic. I see villages, raised languages, silenced cultures, fractured. Discovery and conquest were twin faces of the same age, inseparable, each feeding the other. To tell the story of discovery without the story of loss is to tell only half the truth. But truth itself was expanding. Printing presses multiplied words, spreading ideas faster than ever before. Revolutions of thought stirred about governance, rights, liberty. Empires controlled land, but ideas began to seep through the cracks carried in books, speeches, whispers. The age of stone and river had taught permanence. The age of empire and discovery taught impermanence. Change motion. Humanity was not fixed. It was moving restlessly across seas, across borders, across thought. Sometimes I wonder how it must have felt to live at the edge of this transformation. To be a sailor setting eyes on a shore no map described. To be a scholar opening a book printed in thousands of copies, not one. To be a villager watching strange sails approach bearing strangers whose language and weapons were alien. For some, it must have felt like the world expanding. For others, like it collapsing. Empires rose higher. Myths grew louder. Discoveries spread wider. But beneath it all, the human story was the same curiosity entwined with ambition, wonder shadowed by power. We wanted to know, to explore, to claim, to build. And in that wanting, we stitched continents together, bound humanity's fate into a single fabric. The age of empires and the age of discovery remind me that we are always double-sided. Our reach for the stars is matched by our hunger for control. Our myths inspire us but also blind us. Our discoveries illuminate but also disrupt. We are never only builders, never only destroyers. We are both, always both. And so the empires marched, the myths endured, the ships sailed, and the maps changed. Humanity's circle had widened beyond rivers, beyond continents, beyond the familiar. The story was no longer local, no longer regional. It was planetary. For the first time, Earth was whole, and we were its restless wanderers, still searching, still yearning, still building. The sails that carried empires across oceans had redrawn the map of the world, but they also redrew the map of the mind. For centuries, kings had claimed divine right, priests had claimed divine knowledge and tradition, had claimed authority over life itself. But as books multiplied and discoveries spread, whispers of a new idea began to ripple. That truth was not only in scripture, not only in kings, but could be found by reason, by observation, by experiment. The first revolution was not of machines, but of thought. The Enlightenment did not arrive with the clang of factories. It arrived with pens scratching on paper, with telescopes aimed at stars, with questions spoken in salons and coffee houses. What is justice? What is liberty? What is knowledge? These were not idle questions. They were sparks, small at first, then blazing. Philosophers like Locke, Montesquieu, and Rousseau debated the nature of government, insisting that power should not be absolute, that people had rights beyond the whims of rulers. Voltaire sharpened wit into a weapon mocking tyranny and superstition. Diderot compiled knowledge into encyclopedias, declaring that information itself was power. And across Europe, ideas spread faster than armies, unsettling monarchs more than swords ever could. Science, too, was transformed. Galileo's telescope had shown moons circling Jupiter, defying dogma. Newton's laws revealed a universe governed not by chaos or miracle, but by order predictable and elegant. The Earth was no longer the unmoving center of creation. It was one planet among many spinning through vastness. For some, This realization was terrifying. For others, liberating. The universe had become larger, but also more knowable. I imagined the wonder of standing beside Newton as he sketched diagrams of falling apples and orbiting planets, realizing that the same force bound both. Or watching a crowd peer through Galileo's telescope, gasping as they saw craters on the moon, realizing it was not a perfect sphere, but a world scarred like our own. These were moments when the veil of myth lifted begin. Reality itself seemed richer, deeper, more astonishing than legend. But thought alone does not change the world, it prepares it. The Industrial Revolution was thought made steel philosophy, made machine curiosity, made power. It began quietly in workshops, where inventors tinkered with gears and boilers, where coal fires glowed in furnaces. But soon, smoke rose over towns' rails stretched across fields, ships powered by steam cut across seas. Humanity had unlocked energy on a scale nature alone had once commanded. The spinning jenny turned cotton into cloth faster than any hand could. Steam engines drove pistons with relentless force. Iron smelted in blast furnaces, built bridges that spanned rivers, locomotives that outran horses, factories that never slept. Cities swelled as people left fields for mills, their lives tied not to sun and season, but to clock and wage. The rhythm of humanity shifted from the slow pulse of agriculture to the pounding beat of industry. Yet progress carried its shadows. Chimneys blackened skies. Rivers foamed with waste lungs filled with coal dust. Children worked long hours in mills, their small fingers nimble but weary. Families crowded into tenements, disease spreading faster than medicine could keep pace. Industry promised abundance, but often delivered exploitation. For every shining machine, there was a human body bent beneath it. And still change accelerated. Railroads shrank continents. Telegraph wires carried words across miles in moments. Factories produced goods not only for survival, but for comfort, for status, for desire. The very meaning of wealth shifted, no longer measured only in land, but in capital investment machinery. Nations that mastered industry grew powerful. Those that did not fell behind. Empires once built on conquest now relied on coal and steel. The revolutions of thought and industry fed each other. Science discovered electricity. Industry harnessed it. Industry created microscopes and engines. Science used them to peer deeper into life and matter. Philosophy questioned injustice. Factories highlighted it as workers demanded rights unions' dignity. The French Revolution had cried liberty, equality, fraternity. The Industrial Revolution gave those cries urgency, echoing in strikes, protests, reforms. What strikes me most about this age is how fast everything accelerated. For thousands of years, life had changed slowly, generation to generation. But now, within a single lifetime, a person could be born in a village lit by candles and die in a city blazing with electric lights. A child could grow up walking dirt roads and see trains thunder past by adulthood. Change was no longer a distant rumor. It was daily, tangible, unstoppable. I often wonder how it must have felt to live in London in the 1800s, walking streets where horse-drawn carts rattled alongside locomotives, where factories belched smoke beside cathedrals centuries old. To feel both awe at invention and despair at its costs. To dream of a future brighter than ever before, yet fear it might devour the very fabric of society. And yet, humanity pressed forward as it always does. The same curiosity that drove philosophers to ask why also drove engineers to ask how. The same imagination that painted revolutions in art and politics fueled inventions in laboratories and factories. We were remaking the world, not just in stone and river, not just in empire and sail, but in steam, steel, and electricity. The revolutions of thought and industry remind me that progress is never pure, never simple. Every breakthrough carries consequences. Every machine frees and binds, empowers and exploits. Every idea enlightens and unsettles. But together they push us forward, reshaping not only our world, but our very understanding of what it means to be human. And so the pens scratched the gears, turned the engines, roared. Humanity had discovered not only how to think differently, but how to build differently, live differently, dream differently. The pace of change had become relentless and there was no going back. The world had entered an age of revolutions, and from here it would only accelerate. The machines had remade the world, and with them humanity itself. But invention is never still. It grows restless, reaching further, faster, louder. By the dawn of the 20th century, we were no longer only creatures of field and factory, but creatures of engines, wires, and steel. The rhythm of life beat with accelerating force, and it carried us into a century both magnificent and terrifying. The modern age arrived not with quiet steps, but with thunder. Trains crisscrossed continents, steamships plied oceans, telegraph lines stitched voices across distances once unthinkable. Electricity lit streets, powered factories, and brought voices through wires into homes. The night itself, once the dominion of darkness and stars, was pierced by light bulbs glowing like fragments of captured sun. For the first time in history, humanity could banish night at will. But this mastery carried unease. When power can bend nature, it can also break it. And when nations armed themselves with the tools of industry, the engines of progress became engines of war. The First World War shattered illusions of unending progress. Soldiers marched to battle with faith in technology, only to meet barbed wire machine guns and poison gas. Fields once fertile turned to mud trenches, carved scars across landscapes, and the air filled with the scream of shells. Humanity had taken the ingenuity of industry and turned it into slaughter on a scale unimaginable before. Millions perished, empires crumbled, and yet the world reeled forward, stunned, but not stopped. What astonishes me is how quickly creation and destruction twined together. Even as war devoured lives, invention surged. Airplanes, once fragile experiments of wood and fabric, soared into the skies. Radios crackled with news, connecting entire nations in real time. Medicine advanced under the pressure of necessity. Blood transfusions, antiseptics, surgical techniques. Out of the horror of war came both despair and discovery, a paradox that defines the modern age. The war ended, but peace was uneasy. The roaring 20s brought jazz cinema skyscrapers, automobiles a whirlwind of speed and style, of freedom and experimentation. Cities pulsed with energy, neon lights glowing, music spilling from clubs, new ideas flashing in art and science. But beneath the glitter lay fragility. Wealth was uneven debt, mounting markets unstable. When the Great Depression struck, it swept across continents like a silent plague, shattering economies, leaving millions hungry, jobless, desperate. And then another war. If the first had shocked the world, the second engulfed it entirely. From Europe to Asia, Africa to the Pacific, the globe itself became battlefield. Armies marched with tanks, skies roared with bombers, seas churned with submarines. Entire cities burned their names, etched into memory. Warsaw, London, Stalingrad, Hiroshima. The cruelty was staggering: genocide, famine, devastation on scales almost impossible to comprehend. But again, alongside destruction, invention leapt forward. Code breakers built the foundations of computers. Jet engines cut through skies. Rockets born as weapons pointed toward space. And in the deserts of New Mexico, the atom was split, unleashing a force older than the stars. When the mushroom cloud rose above Hiroshima, humanity crossed a threshold it could never uncross. For the first time, we held in our hands the power to end not only nations, but ourselves. I cannot imagine the weight of that moment, the silence after the blast, the realization among scientists and generals that the same intellect which had cured disease, built bridges, and painted masterpieces had also crafted a weapon that could erase entire cities in seconds. It was not only the dawn of a new age of war, it was the dawn of a new age of fear. From then on, every advance carried the shadow of annihilation. Yet, astonishingly, even in the shadow of nuclear fire, humanity reached higher. The Cold War was a contest not only of weapons, but of dreams. Two superpowers strained against each other, their rivalry spilling into every corner of the globe. But in their struggle, they also looked upward toward the stars. Satellites orbited Earth, voices and images bounced across space, and in 1969 a human being set foot on the moon. I imagine the hush of that moment, the flicker of a black and white television, the grainy figure descending a ladder, the words spoken slowly, almost humbly: one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. For the first time, we had left the planet of our birth. In the silence of space, humanity declared itself more than earthbound. We had become wanderers of the cosmos, even if only for a moment. The 20th century was a century of opposites: devastation and wonder, cruelty and compassion, destruction and discovery. We split the atom, mapped the genome, built the internet. We created vaccines that saved millions and weapons that could kill millions. We painted canvases that broke tradition, wrote novels that questioned meaning, composed music that captured both sorrow and joy. Never before had humanity experienced such extremes so closely entwined, and beneath it all the earth itself began to change. Factories that had once symbolized progress now filled skies with smoke, oceans with waste, forests with stumps. The very success of industry strained the planet. Species vanished, glaciers retreated, rivers dried. Scientists warned of warming seas, rising temperatures, fragile ecosystems tipping toward collapse. For the first time, humanity faced not only the possibility of destroying itself with war, but of unraveling the very systems that sustained life. I often wonder if this realization will be the true test of our age. We learned to harness fire, then steam, then electricity, then atoms. But can we learn to harness responsibility, restraint, foresight? Can we balance ambition with humility, invention with preservation? The modern age has given us wonders beyond imagining, but also fragility beyond denial. What amazes me is how interconnected it all has become. A decision in one nation ripples across oceans in hours. A market crash in one city echoes across continents. A virus spreads from one village to the world in weeks. We are no longer scattered tribes or distant empires. We are a single planetary species bound by trade, communication, and fate. Sometimes I try to picture a person living through the span of this century. Born in 1900, they might have ridden a horse to school, lit lamps with oil, written letters by hand. By the time they died, they could have flown in jets, watched television, spoken across continents, in seconds seen pictures of Earth from space. For them, the world would have transformed not once, but a dozen times, each change rewriting reality itself. And yet, beneath all the speed, the wars, the wonders, the fragility, the human heart remained the same. We still loved, dreamed, mourned, hoped. We still told stories, painted walls, built homes, sang songs. The modern age amplified everything: our power, our danger, our potential, but it did not erase our essence. Now, as I look back on it, I see the 20th century not as a break from history, but as its acceleration. Every theme that had marked our past, our ambition, our curiosity, our violence, our creativity, was amplified, magnified, intensified. It was as though humanity had finally found the lever Archimedes once dreamed of, and with it had begun to move the world itself. But the question remains: to where? For all our progress, the modern age leaves us with uncertainty. We stand at a crossroads of wonder and peril, holding in our hands the means to explore stars or extinguish ourselves. The story is not finished. It continues even now, in every decision we make, in every dream we pursue, in every resource we consume or preserve. The earth turns as it always has. The rivers flow, the forests breathe, the skies stretch wide. But for the first time, the future of Earth rests not only in natural forces, but in us. And that truth, more than any empire, any discovery, any inventions, the defining legacy of the modern age. The modern age has left us standing at a threshold, and I feel the weight of it every time I look around. Cities glow with lights visible from orbit satellites, circle above, carrying voices and images across the globe, and scientists peer into the tiniest particles while also gazing at galaxies billions of light years away. Humanity has stretched its mind and its machines further than any creature before it. And yet, the more we reach, the more fragile everything feels. I think often about this paradox: never before have we been so powerful, and never before have we been so vulnerable. We carry the means to heal diseases that once ravaged generations, but we also carry the means to release plagues of our own making. We can split the atom for energy that lights entire cities, but that same atom can annihilate them in a flash. We can feed billions with technology, but our methods exhaust the soil and warm the air. The future is not a path laid before us. It is a choice branching at every step. Sometimes I imagine the earth itself watching us, the way a parent watches a child who has grown tall, strong, and restless. The planet has endured asteroid impacts, ice ages, volcanic winters and extinctions, and always life has found a way to continue. But humanity is different. We are no longer just passengers on this planet. We are shapers of its destiny. The forests fall because of us. The climate warms because of us. The oceans rise because of us. And yet, so too can they heal because of us, stabilize because of us, endure because of us. The choices before us are vast and they stretch across every horizon. We could choose a future of balance where technology serves life rather than consumes it, where energy flows from sun and wind instead of smoke and flame, where food is grown without stripping the earth bare. Or we could choose recklessness, chasing short gains while leaving deserts in our wake, filling skies with carbon seas, with plastic soils, with poison. The line between these futures is not abstract. It is drawn by the daily decisions of billions of hands, billions of minds. But the future is not only about survival, it is also about dreams. For centuries, we dreamed of flying and we built airplanes. We dreamed of reaching the stars and we walked on the moon. We dreamed of speaking across distances and now our voices travel faster than thought. What we dream now will shape what comes next. Do we dream only of consumption, of endless growth, of more and more without asking why? Or do we dream of harmony, of exploration, of wisdom equal to our power? I find myself drawn to both horizons, the one here on earth and the one beyond. On earth, we have unfinished work. Millions still live without clean water, without food security, without shelter. Inequality yawns between wealth and poverty, between opportunity and despair. If we cannot care for one another here, how can we claim to be ready for the stars? Yet beyond Earth, the stars call. Mars waits, silent and cold, its deserts reminding us of what Earth could become if neglected. Moons of Jupiter and Saturn hold oceans beneath ice, perhaps harboring life unseen. Beyond them, exoplanets orbit suns, light years away, some rocky, some blue, some perhaps with skies as wide as ours. The infinite horizon tempts us. Space travel is not just science, it is poetry, it is myth, reborn. When we look upward, we are reminded that we are not only creatures of soil and water, but of curiosity and wonder. To step onto another world would not only expand our survival, but expand our imagination. And yet, I know the truth. No matter how many planets we reach, this Earth will always be our first and greatest home. If we fail to honor it, no voyage among stars will redeem us. The future, then, is not a single road, but a weaving of paths, survival and wonder, preservation and exploration, humility and ambition. We must learn to walk them together or risk losing everything. I imagine centuries from now, people telling stories of this time. Perhaps they will speak of us as the generation that squandered, that turned abundance into ruin, that ignored the warnings written in melting ice and burning forests. Or perhaps they will speak of us as the generation that awoke, that chose differently, that transformed fear into wisdom. The story is not finished, it is in our hands. What comforts me is that choice is not only in the hands of leaders or inventors or billionaires. It is in each of us, in the way we live, the way we treat one another, the way we imagine the future. Empires rise and fall, machines come and go, but imagination has always been our constant companion. If we can imagine a better world, we can begin to build it. And so I stand here at the edge of history and I look forward. I see skies filled with satellites and space stations, but I also see forests regrown, rivers cleaned, air cleared. I see children growing up with hope, learning not only to build, but to care. I see humans walking on other planets, but also tending carefully to this one. The infinite horizon is not out there alone. It is also here in the daily choices that ripple into centuries. The earth turns beneath us, steady, patient, carrying our triumphs and our mistakes alike. It does not rush, it waits. The question is whether we will learn to wait with it, to move with it, to live not only for ourselves, but for the life that surrounds us. If we do, then perhaps our story will not end in fire or silence, but in harmony, in wonder, in continuity. This is where the story of Earth has brought us through chaos and creation, through ice and fire, through empires and industry, through wars and wonders. And this is where the story turns to us, asking not what Earth will do, but what we will do. The infinite horizon is before us. It is vast, uncertain, fragile, magnificent, and it is ours to choose. So, as we close this journey together, I want to pause, to breathe, to let the weight of it settle. We are part of something vast and ancient, and yet we carry in us the future of it all. That is both a burden and a gift, a responsibility and a wonder. Thank you for walking with me through this story, for listening, for imagining, for remembering. If this journey has stirred something in you, I invite you to stay with us, to subscribe to Beyond Earth Stories, to continue exploring together. There are more questions to ask, more horizons to follow, more stories to tell. Until then, may you carry with you a sense of wonder, and may your days be touched with peace. Thank you, and may you be well. I'll see you in the next video.